So today I'm actually going to be preparing and presenting and preaching in English. I don't do that very often. I do give other presentations in English, but not so much actually in church. I'm so used to actually preaching and speaking in our language and at home with my kids, but there's certain topics that I do like to kind of cover in English, and this is one of those topics. I'm really, really happy to be with you today. This topic today is not only it's for everyone, but I did want to focus in on some of the young people, and as young as you can understand me, I think it'll be relevant to you. But I want to talk about the world that we see around us. I have to say, this is actually very strange to preach in English, I have to say. I'm surprised how much I'm shocked listening to myself speak in English. I'm actually quite surprised. So the world around us, when we look at the world around us, what is it that we actually see? How do we perceive the world around us? What is it that we see? And what we realize that when we look at the world and what's going on in the world, it's very much shaped by the perceptions that we have of the world. There are certain situations that happen in our lives, with certain things that happen every day, and people are always in some sort of conflict because they're always talking about their point of view. And it's actually funny, my dad just spoke this morning in the part about mission, just talking about you can't even say somebody is incorrect because everyone is correct. It's very interesting the kind of world that we live in, but in a way, perceptions are real. If we take a look at this particular picture, it's a very well-known picture. Many, many years, I've seen it when I was a kid. What is it that you see when you look at this picture? What do you see? A young lady or an old lady? And you can see either one, depending on how you look. Which one of you is actually right? Both of you are actually right. If we take a look at this photo here, what is it that you see? You just see a gibberish. It's actually very difficult to see. That's true. Unfortunately, it's not bright enough. But some people can basically see, on one hand, you'll see a mustache over here and an eye at the top, and you'll see somebody's face. But when you look at it in a different light, you actually kind of see a young lady that's reading something in her hand over top of a bed. And that's a drape, essentially, that you see across the side. So it's very interesting that perceptions very much are real, and we don't only see it in special pictures that people draw, but we actually see it a lot in history. If I was to show you this map, and this is a World War II map that I just found on the web, I have no idea actually if it's correct or not, because oftentimes history books are written by the people in the countries that they're from, and they really represent it the way that they understand it, how they perceived that history, how they understood it from their point of view. And I'll tell you, just a lot of you that have studied in former Yugoslavia compared to us that might have studied in Canada, our history books show very different perspectives of what actually happened. Are they both wrong or are they both right? Let's keep on going. If we think about our society that we live in, from one point of view, people look at our society and they actually see progress in our society. They see people that are more tolerant than ever before. They see people that are more accepting of other people. You can be anything that you want. We need to accept you that way. We are going to have more educated people in the world. And with education, it solves a lot of issues with intolerance that you might have. Exploitation of the world. How much slavery was happening 200 years ago? A lot of that is now no longer here. And so we have this perspective that actually, as a society, we're getting better. Slow down? Yeah, I might actually speed up. That's the problem here. But I will try to slow down a little. Let me try to move this a little bit. Maybe it's a little too loud and I'm yelling. So we have these kinds of perspectives of what a better society might look like, but then we might have this kind of perspective. Is it really a better society? And so Stefan, I actually saw Stefan today reading inside of the children's room class, the lesson. And I think, Stefan, you're going to recognize some of these words because they were studying these exact words coming from the Bible saying that there's going to be more selfishness, that there's going to be more greed, where we actually see people more greedy for money than ever before in history, that we see pride taking over anything else. It doesn't matter. My pride comes first. If you damage my pride, I'm not going to listen to you. I'm not going to respect you. There's people that are more slanderous, pulling people's name through the mud just to bring them down so that you can be lifted up. We see that kind of attitude, especially in the political space, is the most obvious one, but we see that happen everywhere. We see people that are more unforgiving than ever before, that they hold on to things and never let go. So which of these perspectives is right? Which one are we actually going to pay attention to? Why should we trust the Bible and what the Bible is actually saying? If we take a look at Darwin and his evolutionary theory, there's this medical news today that kind of summarizes what Darwin was trying to say. And he says that evolution is slow and incremental, with tiny genetic changes spread tens of thousands of years apart, gently pushing forward changes in species. Very interesting. Why would something that's so random, why would these genetic minor changes push forward? Why does it must push things forward? Why? There's two different perspectives of how evolution might work. One person, Stephen Gould, said in the year 2000, he said, there's been no biological change whatsoever in humans in 40 to 50,000 years. Obviously, I mean, he's not a Christian thinking the way that we do in terms of how long people have been here. But the point is there's this accusation. No, there's been no biological change. And then 9 years later, you come out with this kind of statement from Cochrane and Harpending saying, rather than there having been no biological change in humans over the past 50,000 years, human evolution has accelerated in the past 10,000 years. And so there's constantly debates. One year they're going to say one thing about evolution, the next year they say something else. Now, the example that Cochrane and Harpending use is this thing. Do you know what this is? A glass of milk. They say, well, 10,000 years ago, people were intolerant of lactose intolerant. They could not drink milk. But because over the years, people started drinking milk, they actually started to become more tolerant to milk. And nowadays, I hear people are becoming less tolerant to milk. And it keeps on going. Like, which is the right thing? And for me, what's most perplexing in my mind is we've adapted and we've evolved so much, yet there's this one thing that we can't get over, and it's the peanut. We cannot solve the peanut. There's allergies everywhere you go where there's kids. There's these big no peanuts allowed. We cannot evolve enough to eat peanuts. All the science in the world that we have, everything we know about evolution, and we cannot eat a peanut. Why can't we solve the peanut? And so we start realizing that there's constantly two ways that we can look at something. Has anyone seen this picture before of this ark? This ark exists. This is a real ark. It's measured to spec, built to spec from Noah's Ark, and it exists in Kentucky. This museum opened up in 2016. And so you can actually go and visit this ark. You can see the real, I don't know if they have animals. Do they have animals? Maybe. I wouldn't be surprised. And it's a massive ark, and they made it as a display, and maybe we can all go and look at this ark one time. It would be great. And what's really interesting about this ark is that it represents a flood. Now, the flood is not a new concept. And people, when they look at the flood, even Christians today, look at the flood in a variety of ways. And one of the main arguments that I've heard is this idea of Noah versus Utnapishtim. Who is Utnapishtim? Do people know who this person is? Have you heard of them? This is like the most, talked about thing. Noah's not the first one to talk about the flood. In fact, what we have is this story, Epic of Gilgamesh, that was written more than 5,000 years ago. They think it's up to 5,000 that was written on stone. Genesis, though, on the other hand, was written much later. And so they think because there's so many similarities between these stories, it must be the case that Noah's story is just a derivative of Utnapishtim. So it can't be a true story. That's what people say. Of course, that's one perspective that you can look at it. The other perspective is if there really was a Noah and an ark, all kinds of different peoples derive from Noah, And they basically talk about these stories and write them down in different ways. They might have made fairy tales about them. And it could be also that God actually preserved the original story through a line that happened to be written later, but it's actually more true. It doesn't have to be correlated based on when something was written, that because it's older, it's more true than something that's written now. There's no correlation to truth because of when something is actually written. So there's various ways of looking at this. Now, how many of you know who this person is? Bill Nye, the science guy. Excellent. Look at the kids in the back. He had a television show in the 90s, from 93 to 98. Some of these kids aren't even born in that time. But Bill Nye, the science guy, I mean, he was our hero as a kid. This is when I'm 12 years old, 13, 14. I didn't watch it that much myself at home, but at my friend's house, we'd watch this. I mean, he made science so much fun. This was a guy that really loved science and loved to teach us about science and loved to teach kids about it. I mean, really, if you wanted a child to love science, this is the guy to do it. Now, Bill Nye, though, is actually very, very strongly against the idea of Noah's flood, though. And when you think of this, he was one of the high-profile scientists in a way. He's more of a television, person, but he's also somewhat of a scientist, I suppose you can say. And he's like the high-profile figure that came to visit that Noah's Ark in Kentucky when it opened in 2016. And so Bill Nye comes over there and he visits, and he's just saying, this is a disgrace. We actually shouldn't have this ark at all. This is actually putting us back in time. He's really disgusted by it. And you realize that the guy that created that ark, that built it, he had a quote that I'm quoting here. He goes, Bill challenged me about the content of many of our exhibits, and then I challenged him about what he claimed and what he believed. You see this constant tension. Hey, I'm claiming something and you're claiming something. And then I love how he puts this. It was a clash of world views. Their worldview was completely different. Perception is so important as to how we actually take something that it shapes our worldview, so much so that we're constantly in this battle. How do we actually live a life of faith? We want to be here living a life of faith. But then the question is, how do we do that? That's not such an easy thing. How about those people that are constantly stuck on these things that they can't get over about the Bible or about faith? How do they get past that? And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through the Bible in a very specific story, John chapter 9. This is going to be very easy for Vicky, this translation. And why I say that is because me and Vicky are the head teachers for the kindergarten class. And this week was about this story from John chapter 9. So Vicky, veoma jednostavno za tebe. This will be very easy. Non-believer's perspective. What we have in this story is a very simple story, but we're going to break down this story today into two parts. Part one is going to say, what is the non-believer, what is his point of view? How does the non-believer approach this very same situation? And when we're finished with that perspective, we're going to go over to, well, there's a believer in this story. What perspective and what actions did he take? How are they different? It's the very same story. The same kind of impact could have been made, but it wasn't. Why is that? Powerful, clear, easy story, but wildly different outcomes for the different people. Let's take a look. John chapter 9, verse 1. Now, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Who sinned that he was born blind is the question. What does this actually reveal to us about this question? They have this belief, this fundamental belief, that because somebody sinned, whether he did, although he wasn't even born yet, he was born blind, did he sin or did his parents sin, and that's why he was born blind? They have this perception and an understanding of God which isn't actually correct. The Desire of Ages actually talks about this. Ellen White writes, Satan is the one who had led men to look upon disease and death as proceeding from God. That was Satan's trick. That was Satan's trick about positioning it this way. And so the number one concept that we start finding about people that go along a path of really not accepting Christ is because they have this idea of misunderstanding of God, and they have a misunderstanding of sin. When we talk about the Bible a lot and understanding where sin came from, understanding what it is, what impact it has, it's so critical. When we're studying about God, understanding the proper viewpoint of who God is, what is he like, is so critical because he's not the one punishing people because they're sinners. Satan is the one that misled them and meant to look upon disease and death as proceeding from God. And so the first one is a proper understanding of God. The next thing, before we get to this verse, we're going to read what happened, right? So we have this person that's blind from birth, and they asked him, what made him blind? But before we read 9 verse 8, we're just going to read in our Bibles verses 6 and 7. It's a very simple story. That goes like this. When he had said these things, he spat on the ground, made clay with the saliva. He anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay, and he said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Just a couple elements of the story. But here's what I wanted to focus in on verse 8. So his neighbors and others who knew him as a blind beggar, they went about and they started asking each other, hey, isn't this the man who used to sit and beg? This man is sitting right in front of them, but they can't believe their eyes. Like, it can't be him. This thing just happened in front of them, but their mind is not registering. God just made an amazing miracle, and they just can't understand, how is this possible? How is this possible for something like this to happen? And it goes on again, and some say, this is he, and others said, this is him. And I'm reminded of this story of this picture on the screen. Who knows who this person is? It's Clark Kent. Absolutely. Clark Kent, he's on the left. But who's this guy on the right? It's Superman. Oh no, it can't be the same guy. He took his glasses off, and he has a swivel in his hair, and he has tights on. It can't be him. And I'm kind of thinking of these people looking at the blind man that can see now, and they just, no, it can't be him. He's right in front of you. He's the news reporter there, and under his shirt is tights. And no, I can't believe that that's actually him, And it's so funny because there's something that's actually happening. It's right before your eyes, and you just don't get it. You can't see it. And then they come out with a question. Therefore they said to him, how were your eyes opened? How? How did that happen? The next thing that they asked is, where is he? And then he said, I do not know. So what's going on, they ask the blind man, how did this happen? Part 1. And part 2 of the question, where is he? Who's he? It's about Jesus. So this thing happened right in front of them, and they saw it happen, but they ask, how did this happen? And I'm really reminded of the idea that they're asking the question, mechanically, how did that work? How is it possible that saliva and dirt being put on a person's eyes makes him see? I don't get it. And you know what? I can't talk to you anymore because you don't get it. I have to go and find Jesus. Why do I need to find Jesus? Not so that I can worship him, but I need to find him so that I can question him. I need to find Jesus because he needs to explain mechanically, how did you walk on water? The idea is he walked on water, but how did you do that? And you start getting so stuck up on this question of how. How does the world work? How does God actually work? We talk about God a lot here, and we start asking questions, well, how does God actually work? How do the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit actually work together? How? And we're so stuck on that. So many different topics in the Bible we get stuck on. And Ellen White continues along this line in a slightly different fashion, and she says, you see, the disciples were not called upon to discuss the question. The disciples weren't called upon to discuss the question. Which question she relates to is not so much the how, but she asks about as to who had sinned and had not sinned. Remember verse 1 that talks about what did he do to sin? But listen to what her point was. Right in front of you, something amazing happened. But she's saying, but to understand the power and mercy of God in giving sight to the blind. The outcome was supposed to be that God is powerful and that he's merciful, but they come along and ask, but how did you do that? That's the completely wrong question to actually ask. The point that Jesus wanted to share was that he's to understand his power and the mercy of God. And so number 2, what happens with people that go along a non-believer's track is the how becomes more important than the outcome. The how of how God works becomes more important than the outcome. And so you get stuck. You get stuck of asking these questions that you'll never get through. And you can't get yourself to believe. How do you believe that Jesus is going to raise people from the dead? How will that work for people that are cremated or thrown into the sea or all kinds of, terrible things that have happened? How is God going to bring those people to life? How will that work? How will the graves just open up? How is this all going to work? And you get stuck on this topic and can't get past, instead of the topic that Jesus is powerful over death and is going to raise us up. How? I don't know. But the outcome is that we're going to be in this new earth and new kingdom. And we forget what that outcome is. Now we keep going on. He said to them, this is how he responds, the blind man that can now see. He put clay on my eyes, I washed, and I see. How did this happen? This is how it happened. He put clay on my eyes, I washed, and I see. How complicated of an answer is this? Is this a complicated answer? Did he explain the molecules within the actual dirt and what they actually did to his eyes that were suffering from some sort of disease, perhaps? I have no idea. You see, it's very obvious. There was no healing virtue in the clay or in the pool, but the virtue was in Christ. That's where the power was, in Christ. And you're missing the point. Now, the Pharisees, says Ellen White, could not but be astonished at the cure. You see, they were surprised. This is amazing. This is something that's truly amazing. I'm seeing it happen in front of me, but still, they continue with their line of reasoning, which goes like this. You see, the man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. So they're blocked now because he didn't keep the Sabbath. He healed him on the Sabbath. Was that an actual sin to heal on the Sabbath? What do we know today? No. So they're actually starting to make these false claims about Jesus, about the Sabbath, about the law. They have a misunderstanding of the law itself. In the Bible, it actually says, John 12:37, but despite all the miraculous signs Jesus had done, most of the people still did not believe in him. Do you see that oftentimes people say, oh, if only I had a sign. If only I didn't see someone get healed from cancer, something that I can't see, I'd rather actually see someone's arm grow back. I want to see that kind of miracle, and then I'm going to believe. The Bible is very clear. We have historical references over and over that Jesus did many miracles. And he says, John 12:37, but despite all the miraculous signs Jesus had done, most of the people still did not believe in him. Don't think that a miracle is going to change your perspective. The miracle is not the thing that's going to make a believer out of you just like that. Don't rely on miracles to happen for that to actually be the convincing point, because you could still be deciding not to. Miracles don't have an impact. Not for people that are going along that direction. Why? Because they come back and they ask again, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And so the next step is they're actually calling Jesus a sinner. Do they know that Jesus is a sinner? Maybe based off of these false ideas of what the Sabbath is. But how can a man who's a sinner do such signs? You see, they brought upon judgment on Jesus based on poor assumptions, false assumptions. They brought certain assumptions about Jesus that they couldn't accept anymore. But the Jews did not believe that he had even been blind. That's the next step. So not only did you see this miracle happen, but now they're questioning the whole idea. Maybe he wasn't actually blind to begin with. Imagine that. You see this thing happen, this miracle happens, and they come back and say, that didn't actually happen. He wasn't actually blind in the end. They start to diffuse the whole situation. There was the man himself, Ellen White writes. He's standing right in front of you. He's declaring that he had been blind and had his sight restored. But the Pharisees would rather deny the evidence of their own senses than admit that they were in error. And so powerful is prejudice. Do you get that? They would rather deny the evidence of their own senses. They see, they feel, they touch. They'd rather deny all that because they don't want to believe that Jesus is the one that had actually done it. And if you know the story, they go back and, because they question him, I don't even believe that you're blind. What do? They call his parents. Hey, parents, how about you come over? Was this your actual son? Was he actually blind? And yes, he was actually blind. We don't know what happened. How is this possible? And then later in verse 26, they come back again and says, well, what did he do? And how did he open your eyes? The same kind of questions come up again. And so you find yourself in this circle, constant circle. How did this happen? This is what happened. This is, I'm describing. He put this on my eyes and I was able to see. But how? How does it make it? And you go into this never-ending loop. You can never break out of that cycle. Something needs to change in the perspective and how you see the world around you. You're essentially having people that are choosing not to believe. You see things happen, but by choice, you're saying, no, I cannot believe that. I'm choosing not to believe that. I can't do it. You see, they come back and they say, hey, give God the praise. They're trying to say, give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. That is, do not say again that this man gave you sight. It's God who has done this. Ellen White paraphrases this. So we know that this man is a sinner. So the next element that we're going to talk about, this knowledge. We know. Next thing we see is we know that God spoke to Moses. We know God. Now, whenever I hear somebody say, I know something, especially when it has to deal with, I know who Jesus is, which you don't. First of all, you don't know whether he's a sinner or not. Who are you to actually judge that, to figure that out? Second thing is, we know that God spoke to Moses. How do they know that God spoke to Moses? Through stories. How do they actually know that? They're stories, they have some references, but they weren't there when he was speaking. Right in front of them, as for this fellow, they continue to say, when they look at Jesus, we do not know where he is from. At least say I know that he's from Nazareth because I'm living with him. He's right in front of me, but I'm saying I know what happened in the far past. What does that remind you of? That reminds me a lot of things like evolution. We know that this happened in the past. We know that this happened 3, 4, 5 million years ago. We know this happened 60,000 years ago. Well, you know what? There's very little we actually know. There's evidence of these kinds of things, and same with Moses. There's only evidence that Moses wrote it, but you can't know for sure. You can't. But here, Jesus is right in front of them. Here is somebody that knows you can ask him, you can communicate with him. No, we know what happened way back when. We know how the earth was formed. We know everything on how things were formed. But you know what? There's evidences just as much for evolution. We can't just deny evidences for evolution. That would be quite silly. But there's also evidences for creation. And so how do we pick? How do we know which one is the one? And so we're constantly in this loop of knowing. And so what you have in these non-believers' view is they're so sure in what's actually very unsure. Something that's very uncertain. But they're so sure of it. You're sure that this is how things worked. But you're sure in something that you're actually uncertain of. You get thrown into this scale that's constantly teeter-tottering. Hey, if I get more proofs about God, I'm going to lean towards believing in God. But if I get more proofs towards evolution and God doesn't exist, then I'm going to believe that. And we're on this scale constantly thinking and hoping that maybe our scale is going to tip towards the right and correct direction. But what does the believer actually do? Let's actually learn from what the believer does in this story, from the beginning to the end. And let's go back through the story and focus in on what does the believer actually see and how does he perceive the world, especially when it comes to faith. So after Jesus said this, we're going to reread the story, slightly different translation. He spit on the ground. He made some mud. He smeared it on the man's eyes. And then he said, go wash off the mud in Siloam pool. The man went and washed in Siloam. And when he had washed off the mud, he could see. Right? He had mud. put it on his face, on his eyes. He went to wash, and he could see. We go back to this question. How then were your eyes opened? They asked. And when you look at how he responds, he says, the man they called Jesus, he made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. It's a very simple explanation of the how. He doesn't know the mechanics of what happened, but he knows the steps. He knows the steps. You know, God gave us in the Bible certain steps in life that we could take. We don't know how everything works. We don't know exactly why some animals are clean for us and some are not clean. But he's given us some steps on what we should do in order for us to actually see. He's just given some basic steps. It's not that complicated. But you see, for the believer, the outcome was more important than the how. You see, this was a guy that was blind all his life. Does he actually care that now how God actually did it? Or does he care that finally he can actually see? What's more important to him? He can finally see. He's never been able to see color. He's never been able to see animals. He's never been able to see his parents, his brothers and sisters perhaps. He's never been able to see his friends. He's never even seen the temple that he was begging at all his life. Do you think he cares about the how God did it? Or does he care about what's the outcome? How's it going to impact me now in my family when I start believing in Christ? How's it going to change my perspective on life? How am I actually going to be happy in times when it's the most difficult to be happy in life? How is that going to happen? That outcome of being able to be at peace is way more important than how God's actually going to do it. I don't know how God will do it. And then they ask another question. Well, tell me something. What's your opinion about this man who had healed you? And then the man replies, I think he must be a prophet. He doesn't know that he's a prophet. He doesn't know that. That's just his impression. I don't have the full story yet. I don't know exactly who he is. But you see, he had this experience with Jesus, and the experience with Jesus is what shaped his opinion. So this experience with Jesus that he had, Jesus actually does something in his life, and he has this experience, and it shapes his opinion of who Jesus is. Do we go intentionally day in and day out and actually ask God, I want you to be part of my life, whether it's at work, whether it's in my home, whether it's around my household or my children or education or any aspect of life? Do we include Jesus in that? Do we include God? Building out experiences with God is so critical, but if we don't spend time with him in his word, if we don't even ask him to be with us, how are we going to generate an experience? Having experiences with God are so vital to have the right kind of perspective. Now he says, we know that Jesus is a sinner. And then here's how the man replied to that question. We know he's a sinner. Here's what he says. You know what? No, I don't know if he's a sinner or not. But all I know is that I used to be blind, but now I can see. This is one of the most popular texts that we know of, John 9:25. Hey, I don't know what he is. I don't know how he was born as a baby here. I don't know how that happened. But what I do know is that I was blind, and now I can see. And so anything you tell me about him, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I can't be shaken in my faith because I'm the one that I know I was blind, and I'm the one that I know that I can see. What kind of argument can you tell me about Jesus that's going to tell me otherwise? I've just had that experience. You cannot shake it. But what's important is that he doesn't talk about the things he doesn't know. He spends time on talking about what he does know. You know, one of the interesting things that I've heard many times is this idea of we need to preach the gospel to the whole world, and whoever doesn't accept, they won't make it to heaven, right? So here's the thing. Or whoever hears Christ and rejects them, they won't make it to heaven. Or what about all those people that, have never heard of Christ? How are they going to make it to heaven? And we're so stuck on how is this actually going to happen? You know what? My answer is I actually don't know. What I do know is that he left us this word, and I want to share that message because I believe it to be true. And I know that when I share it, I know by the Bible, by who Jesus is, that by any means possible for every person on earth to be saved, Jesus is doing everything he can to make sure that there's a reason, that he can be the one to justify the reason for them to be saved. I don't know who's going to be saved. That's not even my responsibility. Jesus' responsibility, God's responsibility. That's not my responsibility, but my responsibility is to share. Don't ask me who's going to be saved and who's not going to be saved. I don't know. God is the one to decide that. Talk about what we actually know, not the things that we don't know. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from. And then this, I love his response to that. Why? This is a marvelous thing, And he's starting to joke about this a little bit almost. That you do not know where he's from, yet he has opened my eyes. Tough noogies. I don't care. You don't know where he's from? I don't care. The point is, he's the one that opened my eyes. What are you going to do about it? How is it? That's pretty funny. You don't know him. You know what happened to Moses hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Yet this guy that opened my eyes, you don't know anything. And then he goes off and preaches a little bit. Now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. This is the blind man speaking now, and he continues, since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone had opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. See, his theology was actually quite sound. If he wasn't actually from God, he couldn't do anything here. You see, he's unswayed by all those people that say that they know something that he doesn't. He finds that almost a little bit funny because you know what? He just did this whole experience with me. He's unswayed by the fact that, but I know that the dinosaurs lived such and such year, right? I know that this is how the flood actually occurred. It was actually just localized flood, or maybe didn't even happen at all. I know how the Bible was actually put together. I'm unswayed by the things of what you know. I'm unswayed because I have that experience and I can now see. And then we come and wrap things up with Jesus' response. Jesus is nowhere here. It's almost like he heals him and then whoop, there's no more. We don't hear of Jesus. We only have this correspondence between the blind man and the non-believers, the Pharisees in this case. But I love Jesus' response. You see, we continue reading 9:35, and Rob read this this morning, where he goes, Jesus heard that they had cast him out. He heard that he was now thrown out. They don't want to even talk to him anymore. And when he had found him, he said to him, do you believe in the Son of God? Interesting that Jesus usually actually refers to himself as Son of Man. But in this context, he refers specifically about Son of God. That's a pretty big deal. Do you believe in the Son of God? What I love about this is that when he was in a jam, doesn't know where to go next, Jesus is the one that comes looking for him. It didn't happen the other way around, that he went to go find Jesus. He was satisfied with what Jesus did for him. But Jesus is now ready. Hey, I'm going to take you to the next step. Are you ready to actually believe in God? Are you ready for this? Jesus comes looking for you and I. When we're prepared, when our hearts are prepared, Jesus is looking for each one of us. And that's a magnificent God to believe in. That's not just any God. That's a magnificent God to believe in. That's willing to come and look for you and I. And he answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? This blind man is now at a state that, just tell me, who is he? I'm waiting to find him. You tell me and I'm going to believe him. How many things do we have that are blocking us to say, what is the next step with you, God? Is the next step baptism? Is the next step to open the Bible to learn a little bit more? Is the next step to refresh my relationship with God that I've left to the side for way too long? Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? How do we make that happen? And then Jesus answers these wonderful verses. He says, you've already seen him. And right now, he's talking with you. Today, right now, Jesus is talking to you and I. He's talking to you and he's saying, I'm right here. Talk to me for right now. Don't think of everything everything that the world offers, every single perspective out there. There's way too many. Everyone is right. Everyone is right. Like, if everyone's right, then no one's actually right, right? It's so difficult. But he's saying, I'm right here with you right now. What are you going to do now? And then he said, Lord, I believe. And he starts to worship him. Is that an amazing story about this believer? Do you see the steps that this believer actually took? Ellen White actually says, not only had his natural sight been restored, but the eyes of his understanding had been opened. You see, some people think that when we get to know the Bible, they seem to happen to think that they're going to know what every single political situation, what's going on behind the scenes. That their eyes are going to be open, that I'm going to know all the conspiracies. That their eyes are going to be open, that I'm going to know every single story that's out there. I'm going to know the back end because God's revealed it to us through the Bible. He's told us the prophecies. But you know what? That's not the purpose of why God gives us prophecies. That's not the reason why God is opening our eyes. He's giving us an understanding of ourselves. He's giving us an understanding of the world around us, the state that we're actually in. He is giving us an understanding in a way that nobody else can have understanding. Not because I know everything that's going on, but because I have an understanding that God is the one that's saving me. He's the one that's going to be in my life. He's going to be the one in my home with my children. That's an understanding that can't be taken away. Ellen White writes about this, that Christ has been revealed to his soul, and he blank him. What did he actually do? This is a choice. You and I are sitting here today, and we have this idea that Christ is now revealing himself to us. What's going to happen? What are we going to actually do? In his case, he received him. He believed him, and he ended up worshiping him. In the believer's journey looks different. And I want to focus on this. I don't want to focus on all the negative aspects as to how we can go through this journey and never actually come to Christ. Instead, the believer's journey looks like this, that the outcome is more important than the how. Don't get stuck up on how God does something. Things are going to be revealed. He's promised us, I will. But right now, you just need to know that I'm going to carry you through by the time the sin thing is done, completely done. Experience with Jesus shapes our opinion. Build an experience with Christ. Ask him for that every day. Be patient with him. He's been so patient with us. Be patient with him. Let him actually show you. Experience him in a new way. Talk about the things that you actually know. Don't talk about things that you don't know. Don't make up stuff. Don't go on the internet and just read one article and think that you know everything about that topic. I guarantee you that there's millions of articles to read through before you can form a proper opinion about something. Talk about the things you actually know, not the things that somebody just slapped on the internet. Be unswayed by what others know, quote unquote know. Be unswayed. Don't let that distract you. Because the things that people know today oftentimes can change tomorrow. And I'm not discounting that we don't need to do scientific research and continue to do that. Absolutely. But don't be swayed by, we know that this happens. Yes, there's evidence all over the place for almost every topic out there, but don't be swayed by that. Have that experience and just know that God is opening your eyes. Know that 5, Jesus is going to come looking for you. And when Jesus comes looking for you, you have a choice. You have a choice. Either, what are we going to do? Are we going to receive him, or do we reject him? The choice is really up to us. Amen.
Zahvaljujemo Mladenu na vrlo interesantnoj propovedi. I evo na kraju ćemo pronaći pjesmu broj 189, posle koje će se Mladen pomoliti i završit ćemo naše bogosluženje. Pjesma broj 189.
Oče naš nebeski, zahvalni smo što si ti naš Bog. Hvala ti što si bio tu da otvoriš naše oči, da bi imali razumevanje o tebi kao nikada prije. Pomozi nama da gledamo život na način kao što je ovaj vernik imao o tebi, o svetu oko njega. Odlučio je da primeti ono što si ti učinio, da je to najvažnija stvar i da se uhvati od toga i njegovo iskustvo sa tobom. Daj nama svima iskustvo sa tobom, da nikada naša vera ne može da opada, nego da samo bude sva jača i jača i da delimo tu radosnu vest kako si ti Bog i da spremaš novo mjesto za sve nas. Hvala ti za sve što si učinio za nas. Čuvaj nas ti i ovdje koji smo i oni koji nisu danas s nama. Blagoslovi nas sve na poseban način. U Isusovo ime te molimo. Amin.